So I'm actually going to begin with a song. Sometimes in class I like to play a song if it relates to the topic, draws the students in a little more. So this is a song by Death Cab for Cutie, and we're just going to listen to part of it, look at some of the lyrics, and see what they have to say. An age-old question, right? One that philosophers and psychologists alike have been trying to answer, and we still don't know the answer to this question, which is, where does the soul, right, meet the body, right? So what do we mean by a soul? What did philosophers mean by a soul? What do scientists think about this idea of a soul, right? Is the soul equal to what we might call the mind? Right, and what is the mind? Is the mind something that is just a function of the brain, or is it something else, right? And if it is just a function of the brain, how does this 2 to 3 pound wet gelatinous mass, right, create the mind, right? So there are a lot of questions, and I don't have answers to any of those questions. But what we will be doing over the course of the next 3 weeks is trying to study some of the functions of the mind, right? So we're going to be focusing on cognition, right? And we're going to talk about what cognition is, but it's basically different mental processes. And we're going to be talking about some of the different mental processes that fall under, right, the functions or the parts of the mind. And maybe by studying the different parts of the mind, right, we can begin to stitch together the whole, right, and what's going on, right? So like the Gestalt psychologist said, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So we're going to study the parts, right, in an effort to try to maybe understand the whole. So today we're going to be focusing on memory, right, and we're going to be talking a lot about the different processes of memory, right, and we're going to talk about the engram. The engram is defined as the memory trace, right? Like, where does this memory trace exist in the brain, right? And so these are some of the things that I hope to tackle in today's talk, right? So what do we mean by cognition, right? We're going to define what is cognition and what are some of the different cognitive processes. We're going to focus today on memory. So we always need a good working definition, right? Before we talk about something, right? Psychologists, scientists always need to define, operationally define, right, what they're studying. So we're going to be defining memory, and then we're going to talk about different theories, right, for how does memory work, right? So we'll be talking about different memory systems, right? And we're also going to try to tackle where are these memories stored, right? So we believe it's the brain, right? That memories are stored in the brain, but where, right? Is it in one location? Is it spread throughout the brain? Right, so we're going to be talking about that, and maybe we'll also be able to get to how are our memories formed, right? There are a lot of different theories, right, about how do we actually form these memories, these engrams, right? If there are actual physical traces in the brain that we call memory, right, how are those things formed? So we might be getting a little biological today. Cognition, right, which is kind of the umbrella idea that we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks, right, is the mental actions or processes of acquiring knowledge and understanding it. So first we have to get information into our system, right, into our mind, right, and then what do we do with it, right? Once we get it in, we need to do something to it, right, some form of processing, right, in order for us to actually understand it. So we engage in cognition when we think, right, through our thoughts, right, experiences, things that have happened to us before, maybe we learn from them, and also through our senses. We use all of our different senses to get information into our system. So we're it's like a combination of, right, bottom up information coming in through our senses and going out to our brain and we process it. But we also have past experiences, thoughts and ideas and memories that are also working together, what we call top down, to help us understand what's coming in. Cognition encompasses many different functions, right? Attention, memory, reasoning, problem solving, decision making, and language. So today we're going to be focusing on, I think, one of the more interesting cognitive functions, which is that of memory. And then over the course of the next few weeks, we'll also be talking about, right, thinking, problem solving, decision making, and language. So again, talking about the different pieces, right, and then trying to stitch them together to understand the whole. It's a lofty goal, so we'll try it, right. So memory, right, we're going to be focusing on that. So the basic definition of memory is the ability to retain knowledge. So all this information is coming in. How do we hold on to it, right? If we want to hold on to it, right, we need to do something to it. We need to process it in some way. And what we know about memory is that it's actually a very active system. Some of the theories that we're going to be talking about maybe describe memory as kind of being passive, right? But it's not. It's actually a very active system. It uses a lot of the brain, and a lot of different parts of the brain are involved in memory formation, right? And so it's an active system that receives information from the senses. So information is coming in through our eyes, through our ears, through our skin, right? All this information is coming in, right? And then our memory, this system that we're going to talk about, is going to organize that information, maybe alter it, maybe change it in some way, kind of put it all together, and then we need to store it so that we can use it later, right? So the memory system has different stages, different steps that we're going to talk about. Information has to come in, right? Then we have to do something to it, process it, and then store it for safekeeping, right? So that when we need it again, when we need it, we can pull it out, retrieve it, and then use it, right? So it's a very, very active system. And there are 3 different kind of parts to this memory process, and we will be talking about these different parts as we go through today's talk. So the first stage is what we call encoding, right? So that's getting the information in, right? We have to get it in, right, and acquire it. So that's called the encoding process. Once it's in, we need to store it, right? We need to hold it. It needs to go into some holding cell, right? And hopefully we can keep it so that when we need it, right, we can retrieve it and get it out to use it, right? So I always use the example, right, when my students, when they study for a test, right, first they have to acquire the information, but that's not enough, right? You can read a paragraph and then it all goes out the window, right? You don't remember anything. So you need to do something to it. You need to acquire it and encode it in some way, and then store it in the brain, right? In some part of the mind, right? And hold it there so that when you need it, so that when you're sitting in the exam and you're asked a question, you could go into that memory storage bin, pluck it out, and you retrieve it so that you can answer the question, right? So we're going to talk about these different parts to the memory process, how they all work together. Just because we've stored something, does that mean that we can retrieve it when we need it? No, absolutely not, right? You've heard of the very scientific term tip of the tongue phenomenon. That's actually the term for it, right? Where it's on the tip of the tongue, right? And then as soon as, like, someone's name, right? When you see them, you blank out, and then as soon as they walk away, it all comes back. It was there, we had a retrieval failure, right? So we need all parts to be working well, right, for this whole memory process to work. All right. So I say let's begin, but even though we already began, but with a little experiment. I actually do a lot of experiments in class, but I'm gonna save you from those. But this is just a little thought exercise, a little mental exercise. So it's 1 o'clock, right, 1:10, and I want you to think of all the things that you've done so far today, right? So it's probably a long list, or maybe not, but you probably have a lot of things that you've done that you can remember, but there's actually a whole host of information that you've been bombarded with, right, that you probably have no recollection of, right? So how does that work? How does some information get in, and how does some of that information, do we lock it in and store? And really, like, most of the things that happened to us today, we actually, like, don't even remember anymore. Right, so we're going to kind of talk about it, and we're going to see how all of that works together. So we are going to be talking about how our memories formed, right? We're going to talk about neural circuits in the brain, right? That there are these physical traces and how they connect with each other, these physical traces in the brain, right? But it's really amazing if you think about it, right? If you see a picture of your grandmother, right, you could simultaneously, like, you see the picture of her, and then you start thinking about all these things that are connected to her, right? All these different engrams or memory traces that you have associated with grandma, right? So how is that happening, right? Picturing her house. So it also can affect different senses, right? There's the visual, there's the smell, right? Or if she wore a certain perfume, right? The feel of her warm hugs, right? Memory is really complicated, right? And there's so many different aspects to the memory. We acquire information through all of our senses, and we store different traces, right, of each of those senses, putting it together to form grandma, right? But then what happens when we think of grandma, so I have the board, we start to activate smell of cookies, right? Feel of hugs. What is it? House. Picture of house. Right, and these different traces get activated. So we're going to talk more about these neural circuits, right? We talk about how our memories formed. Okay, and we're also going to talk about the brain, right, and which parts of the brain are facilitating the formation of these memory circuits. Okay, so I'd like to begin my talk on memory with Carl Lashley, because Carl Lashley was famous in his never-ending search for the engram, right? So he began in the 1920s, right, searching for, right, what he called the engram, right, this neural trace, right, in the brain. Lashley was, he had his PhD in genetics, and he studied a lot of biology, but he also had minored in psychology and had done a lot of work with John Watson, who was a famous behavioral psychologist. So he did a lot of work with rats running through mazes. And so then what he started to do was he was interested in learning and memory, right? So you learn the maze, how to work your way through the maze, but then you also remember it, because the more times you put the rat through the maze, they get better and better at running through the maze. It's like they can remember. So what he started to do is he would take these rats and he would lesion their brain, destroy different parts of their brain. And then he wanted to see, how does this affect their ability to run through the maze, right? And he was interested in finding the precise location of memory, right? Like, where in the brain is memory stored? And he couldn't do it. No matter where in the brain he lesioned, they were still able to run through the maze. So he's like, well, I guess memory is spread throughout, and it doesn't really matter, right? Every neuron or cell of the brain is equal. Memory is not localized. It's not located in a particular part of the brain. It's kind of spread throughout, right? And it's this equipotentiality, right? That any area, right, could support the engram, right? It's not specific to like the front of the brain or the back of the brain. Location didn't matter. But what did matter was the size of the lesion, right? So the larger the lesion, that would affect their abilities to run through the maze, okay? So what he wrongly concluded was that location didn't matter, the size of the lesion mattered. So the larger the lesions, then the worse they did. So we know that that's not quite true. We will actually be talking about memory is localized into different parts of the brain, right? Some aspects of memory we understand, some we still do not. Okay, so I want to show a short video about one of the most famous case studies, especially when it comes to the study of memory, and that's the case of HM, okay? So we'll watch the video and then we're going to talk about what we've discovered since, right? So we didn't know about the different parts of the brain that were involved in memory, right? Especially if we're going on Lashley's assumption that it doesn't matter, right? So we're going to see what happened to HM, Henry Malaysian, and then we'll discuss.
On September 1st, 1953, William Scoville used a hand crank and a cheap drill saw to bore into a young man's skull, cutting away vital pieces of his brain and sucking them out through a metal tube. But this wasn't a scene from a horror film or a gruesome police report. Dr. Scoville was one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of his time, and the young man was Henry Malaysian, the famous patient known as HM, whose case provided amazing insights into how our brains work. As a boy, Henry had cracked his skull in an accident and soon began having seizures, blacking out, and losing control of bodily functions. After enduring years of frequent episodes and even dropping out of high school, the desperate young man had turned to Dr. Scoville, a daredevil known for risky surgeries. Partial lobotomies had been used for decades to treat mental patients, based on the notion that mental functions were strictly localized to corresponding brain areas. Having successfully used them to reduce seizures in psychotics, Scoville decided to remove HM's hippocampus, a part of the limbic system that was associated with emotion, but whose function was unknown. At first glance, the operation had succeeded. HM's seizures virtually disappeared, with no change in personality, and his IQ even improved. But there was one problem. His memory was shot. Besides losing most of his memories from the previous decade, HM was unable to form new ones, forgetting what day it was, repeating comments, and even eating multiple meals in a row. When Scoville informed another expert, Wilder Penfield, of the results, he sent a PhD student named Brenda Milner to study HM at his parents' home, where he now spent his days doing odd chores and watching classic movies for the first time, over and over. What she discovered through a series of tests and interviews didn't just contribute greatly to the study of memory, it redefined what memory even meant. One of Milner's findings shed light on the obvious fact that although HM couldn't form new memories, he still retained information long enough from moment to moment to finish a sentence or find the bathroom. When Milner gave him a random number, he managed to remember it for 15 minutes by repeating it to himself constantly. But only 5 minutes later, he forgot the test had even taken place. Neuroscientists had thought of memory as monolithic, all of it essentially the same, and stored throughout the brain. Milner's results were not only the first clue for the now familiar distinction between short-term and long-term memory, but showed that each uses different brain regions. We now know that memory formation involves several steps. After immediate sensory data is temporarily transcribed by neurons in the cortex, it travels to the hippocampus, where special proteins work to strengthen the cortical synaptic connections. If the experience was strong enough, or we recall it periodically in the first few days, the hippocampus then transfers the memory back to the cortex for permanent storage. HM's mind could form the initial impressions, but without a hippocampus to perform this memory consolidation, they eroded like messages scrawled in sand. But this was not the only memory distinction Milner found. In a now famous experiment, she asked HM to trace a third star in the narrow space between the outlines of two concentric ones, while he could only see his paper and pencil through a mirror. Like anyone else performing such an awkward task for the first time, he did horribly. But surprisingly, he improved over repeated trials, even though he had no memory of previous attempts. His unconscious motor centers remembered what the conscious mind had forgotten. What Milner had discovered was that the declarative memory of names, dates, and facts is different from the procedural memory of riding a bicycle or signing your name. And we now know that procedural memory relies more on the basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures that were intact in HM's brain. This distinction between knowing that and knowing how has underpinned all memory research since. HM died at the age of 82 after a mostly peaceful life in a nursing home. Over the years, he had been examined by more than 100 neuroscientists, making his the most studied mind in history. Upon his death, his brain was preserved and scanned before being cut into over 2,000 individual slices and photographed to form a digital map down to the level of individual neurons, all in a live broadcast watched by 400,000 people. Though HM spent most of his life forgetting things, he and his contributions to our understanding of memory will be remembered for generations to come.
I remember the live broadcast I watched. Part of it took like hours, but it was just like so fascinating for me. Like this was like one of the biggest cases, right? Case studies in neuroscience, and especially with memory. And it's pretty devastating, right? Here was a guy, he went in, he just needed to control his seizures. And because we didn't know, right, the functions of the hippocampus, they took out his temporal lobes on both sides, and underneath in there is the hippocampus. So most of this structure, right, it's not part of the outside of the brain. I meant to bring my brain model, but it's actually like underneath, was taken out. And what we now know, thanks to HM and so much research, is that the part of the brain that was taken out, this hippocampus, is essential for forming memories, right? So we're going to talk more about the video and the different types of memories. But what HM suffered was a type of amnesia. So amnesia is a memory disorder, right, where we forget. We're more familiar with the concept of retrograde, where we forget the past, retro like going into the past. So we forget past memories, right? But he had a much more severe form of amnesia, which is called anterograde, moving forward. So he wasn't able to form any new memories from that point on. He suffered a little bit of retrograde as well, so he lost a couple of years before the surgery, and then he couldn't make any, conscious memories moving forward. And what was also so amazing was the work of Brenda Milner, who discovered that there are different memory systems, right? And also very different types of memory, right? So that's what we're going to be focusing on now, are some of the different memory systems and the different types of memory that we have, right? So Atkinson and Shiffrin, they proposed a model of memory, the information processing model, which is still one of the more popular models that we have today of memory. So it was the late 60s, early 70s when they proposed this model. And what they said was that the mind was likened to a computer, right? A computer, very powerful processor, right? But you have to put information in, right? And then the computer will work on that information and store it, right? You can click save, and then when you need it, right, you can go into the computer and get it. You have to know where you saved it, right? Which is part of the problem, right? But if you're organized, if your computer is organized and you have your files organized well, it's very easy for you to go in and retrieve that information. So if we store our memories well, right, then we'll be able to easily access them as well. Okay, so how does this work? Well, information is coming in and it enters into the first memory store. So they propose that there are three basic memory stores, right? Sensory memory, They called it short-term memory, but today we actually call it working memory. It's the very active memory store. And then we have long-term memory. That's like where we put everything, right? We store all the information until we need to use it again, right? So what's really fascinating is we have these 3 different memory stores, and information has to flow through the different memory stores, but each memory store has a different capacity. It can hold different amounts of information, and it can hold that information for a certain duration, for a certain period of time. Right? And through a lot of research and experimentation, they've discovered what the capacity, how much information each of these memory stores can hold, and how long we can hold it, right? And we've also now know, because of all this, strategies for helping to improve our memory, right? So one of the goals is to increase the amount of information we can hold, right? Especially in this working memory store. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning, right, in our sensory memory, and we're going to talk very briefly about each of these memory stores. So information has to come in, right? So into the sensory memory store. And sensory memory is information that's coming in from the senses. So we have multiple senses, but most of the research is only done on the visual and auditory sense, right? So the 2 different types of sensory memory that have been really studied to a great degree are the iconic memory, your visual memory trace, right? And the echoic memory, the auditory memory trace. Okay, so the capacity for sensory memory is pretty large. A lot of information is coming in at any one given second, right? We have a lot of visual information, we have a lot of auditory information. But it doesn't last for very long, right? If you don't pay attention, it's gone, right, forever, right? So the iconic trace lasts for about half a second, maybe that long, right? So that means, like, if you see something, you can close your eyes, that trace will still be there, even if you don't try to focus on it. It's because of this iconic trace that animation works, right? Animation is just a series of stills, but because we can hold that visual trace for at least half a second, it creates the illusion, right, of movement, right? So, the people who make animated movies are using that, right? Thanks to that, we can see movement in animation. Then there's the echoic trace. That's the auditory trace. So it lasts a little bit longer, about 2 to 4 seconds, but still, if you don't pay attention, it's gone. But you know, sometimes you have that experience where someone says something to you and you say, "What? Oh," right? Because it lasts for 2 to 4 seconds, even if you weren't fully paying attention at first, you can then grab it and pay attention to it, because the trace lasts for about 2 to 4 seconds. Okay, so anything that we pay attention to is going to move on, right? It's going to move to the next memory store called they called it short-term memory, but today we call it working memory. The way in the original model, the short-term memory system kind of sounded like it was very passive. So Alan Badley said, no, this is working memory. It's a very active store, right? The working memory store is everything that you're currently holding in your head right now, right? So they said it's limited in capacity, right? So psychologist Miller did a lot of studies on what is the capacity of this memory store. And he said it's the magic number 7, plus or minus 2. And that's why phone numbers began as being 7 digits, right? Because they were like, that's the maximum, right, that we can hold in our short-term memory. So the capacity is 5 to 9 units, or what we call chunks, right? So it's not that big, right? And the duration is also pretty short. It only lasts anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds. Now, if you keep repeating, in the old days before cell phones, right, if someone gave you their phone number, what would you have to do? Keep saying it, right? They don't know how to do that anymore, right? It's called rehearsal, maintenance rehearsal. You keep repeating it. So if you're repeating it, that means you're still holding it in your working memory, right? It's still there, because working memory is everything that you're thinking about. So the more you rehearse it, maintenance and rehearsal, the more you repeat it, the longer amount of time it stays in your working memory, which means it has a better chance of moving on, right? A better chance of getting stored into long-term memory. Okay, so the duration is pretty short. The capacity, that's pretty questionable. So they say it's 7 to 9 chunks, but there are some strategies that you can do to expand the amount of information you can hold. So what is the area code for the Bronx? Right? We know that is, if you live in the Bronx, right? Well, today area codes are kind of messed up, but it used to be 718, right? That was the outer boroughs were all 718. So even though that's 3 digits, we lump it together into what's called a chunk. So when you lump information together, group information together, you can expand your working memory store. And that's actually correlated with intelligence, IQ. This is actually tested on the IQ test, is what is your working memory span? How much information can you hold? The more information that you can hold in your working memory and process and work on it, the more intelligent you are. That's a separate theory, right? So we have our working memory store, right? And then information needs to get into the final store, right? Our long-term memory store. And we want information to transfer, so there are many things that we can help, right, in order to encode it. There are certain strategies. I try to teach this to my students, right, to help them study, something called elaboration, right? Make it meaningful. The more meaningful you make the information, the better you're going to remember it, right? And you're going to have better storage, and then it's going to help you retrieve it. So there are tricks, right, that we can learn, right, in order to process information better. Okay. So our long-term memory store is actually pretty complex, right? And this is something that Brenda Milner talked about or found when she was doing her work with HM, right? So we used to think that memory was just one thing, but what we actually now know is that there are so many different types of memory, and that these different types of memory are actually processed in different parts of the brain, which is good, because if you lose one memory system, there's still some other backup systems as well, right? So long-term memory is divided into 2 different types. We have the explicit, meaning the ones that we are conscious of, the ones that we can talk about, so they're also called declarative, because you can declare, right? You can talk about them. And we have 2 types, at least, of explicit declarative memories. We have our episodic memories, the stories of our lives, right? Those are like the autobiographical memories that we have, right? Our experiences, things like that. And we also have semantic memories, memories for general facts. Those are also things that we can declare, right? So we have these episodic and these semantic memories, and those are part of what we call the explicit or declarative memory system. But then we also, what we saw with HM was he lost those memories. He lost the memories or the ability to create memories about himself and about facts. But what did he retain was what we call procedural memories. So if he had learned how to ride a bike when he was a kid, or he could still learn, right? Because procedural memories are in a different part of the brain. So he was able to trace the star, even though he didn't ever remember. He would say, have you ever seen this star before? No. But he was able to get better and better because that was a different type of memory, right? And that's the implicit, meaning unconscious, right, memories. These are motor skills or habits or what are called conditioned learned reflexes, right? You don't think about it, right? If you know how to ride a bike, you just get on and ride it, right? You don't think about, well, first I'm gonna lift my leg and then I'm gonna push the pedal and then the other leg lifts up. It just happens, right? You don't even talk about it, right? They're procedures. So it's also called procedural memory. And what we know is that these different types of memory, right? The the declarative explicit memories and the implicit procedural memories are processed and probably housed in different parts of the brain. Okay, so we're just going to talk about some of the structures that are involved in the different types of memory. The hippocampus, which we've already sort of been introduced to through HM, right? The amygdala and the cerebellum. So this is a picture of a brain flipped upside down. So you're looking at what's called the ventral surface, or the bottom of the brain. Okay, so we're kind of, it's like we turned the brain upside down, and now we're looking directly down onto it. And that's where the hippocampus sits. So this whole outside here is what we call the cortex, the whole outside, the bark of the brain, and then there are structures underneath that are very important as well. So these are the hippocampi, right? You have a left and a right, and the hippocampus is essential for creating memories, right? So this is what was taken out of HM's brain, so he lost the ability to form these memories, right? But the hippocampus seems to be essential for what are the declarative, explicit memories. The memories for events, right, are episodic, autobiographical memories, and the memories for facts, right, are semantic memories. So those are the memories he lost. In addition to the hippocampus, right next to it, so see where the hippocampus is right here? Okay, so in the next slide, you can see right next to it, so here's the hippocampus, and here's the amygdala, okay? The amygdala is involved in emotions, right? Especially negative emotions like anger and fear. Actually, as a side point, overactivity in the amygdala is seen in patients who are depressed, right? There's this overactivity of the part of the brain that's involved in processing emotions, especially negative emotions. It makes sense, right? But the amygdala, since it's very close to the hippocampus, sometimes location of structures tells you a lot about function of those structures, right? So it's involved in emotional memories, right? Which is very much tied to, especially, our autobiographical, right, episodic memories, right? So the amygdala is involved in enhancing, storing these memories, right? Consolidating these memories and storing them. When there's an event that's extremely emotionally arousing, right, we have better memories for them, right? So I'm sure you can remember exactly where you were when you heard on 9/11. Right, when you heard about the planes hitting the towers, right? Anything, so it doesn't have to be negative emotions, right? It could also be positive emotions, but whenever there's something that's highly emotional, right, it actually helps with memory, consolidation, right, and retention. So there's good if it's a positive event. But what does that mean about traumatic events that are highly emotional, right? If a person witnessed or sustained some type of trauma, it means it's going to be very well consolidated and stored, right? So start thinking about like post-traumatic stress, right? These are pretty vivid memories because of the emotional arousal, right? The activation of the amygdala and the hippocampus. Okay, so these are the declarative or the explicit memories, but then we have this whole other memory system that is being controlled by a totally different part of the brain, right? So we were looking at the bottom, right, the ventral surface, right, of the brain, and now, right, we're actually talking about a structure that is not really, I mean, it does have fibers that attach it to the rest of the brain, but it's sort of like right there in isolation. The cerebellum means mini brain because it actually looks like a small version of the larger brain. Here we're looking at the outside, so this is all the cortex, right? And so the cerebellum is considered part of the hindbrain, right? It's attached to this part here, which is called the brainstem, but there are a lot of connections to other parts of the brain. And the cerebellum seems to be essential for these procedural or implicit memories, right? So since HM's cerebellum wasn't touched, he was able to still learn new things, new procedures, right? So it's procedures, practice skills, motor skills. But what would happen if you damage the cerebellum? You'd lose these memories but your declarative memories would still be intact. So this is just another slide of the cerebellum. This is if I cut it in half. I think it looks like cauliflower. But you can see there's a lot going on. It really looks like a small version of that wrinkled cortex, right? So we have like these deeper layers, these nuclei, these more layers that are more on the surface, and then we have all of these fibers that are connecting it to the rest of the brain, right? So the cerebellum is involved not only in these procedural memories for facts, it has so many other functions as well. One of the main things is also balance, right? So it has multiple functions. Okay, so we know that information is processed, right, through the information processing model in a serial fashion, right? It has to go through these different memory stores or stages of memory, right? But we also know that information is processed in a parallel fashion. This is where my students like start to go bonkers, like what is going on? So while you're processing information that's coming in, it's going to sensory memory, to short-term or working memory, to long-term memory, there's still all this other stuff, right? Your mood, right? How hot it is in the room, how cold it is in the room. Did I just have coffee? Am I due for my next coffee, right? That are all also affecting your serial processing. We call that parallel processing. It's happening in parallel, right? And affecting how you are serially processing information. So we have so many different models of memory, right? This parallel distributed processing is saying that, first of all, memory is distributed throughout the brain, kind of going back to Carl Lashley's idea of the engram, right? And it's made up of many different networks, right? We have many different neural networks that can interact together, right? So we can have this idea, I don't know if you can see this, of bird. We have examples of all these different types of birds. We have this idea of mammals, and we have examples of all these different types of mammals. But sometimes, right, some of these, our bird network and our mammal network might interact with each other, where we have like the platypus. What is it? Is it a mammal? Is it a bird? It lays eggs, but it's, so we have these interactions, right? And so we create these neural networks, right, that will interact with each other. And how does this happen? So a neuron are the cells of the brain, right? And we're born, well, we used to think that we were born with all the neurons we would ever have, and that we cannot create new neurons. That's why when you damage nervous system tissue, it doesn't regenerate, right? Central nervous system tissue. But we know actually that that's not 100% true. There is some neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, in one part of the brain, and that's the hippocampus, right? So what is that telling us, maybe, right? That our ability to learn, right, is because, first of all, we have new neurons, right? There are new neurons that are being born in the hippocampus, and we can use those for learning. But we also, our neurons have the ability to grow. And that's called plasticity, right? So our brains, when we're younger, are more plastic, right? That's why kids, they learn so fast, right? They learn very, very quickly. Their brains are more plastic. So what does that mean? It's the ability to reorganize and remodel, right? So when they're learning, right, their neurons are growing. And it looks kind of like trees, right? So these are called the dendrites. They're the branches of the neurons. And when you learn something new, the dendrites will grow. So you don't even need to get new neurons, right? The neurons that you have, right, for grandma, right, can grow and make connections with what a hug feels like, right? You have grandma and, she always makes chocolate chip cookies, right? So then the dendrites for grandma are sprouting together and joining and connecting with the cells, the neurons for cookies, right? So it's we're forming these connections by our brains actually remodeling and changing. And so dendritic growth is also correlated with intelligence. The more dendritic growth you have in the brain, generally, the higher your intelligence. So what is this saying? That when we create memories, right, we have we're proposing this idea, right, that we have different engrams, we have different networks, right, and that we can expand these networks so that they can join together. So that what happens when we think about one memory, it can automatically call to mind all of these other engrams, right, and networks that we have. Okay? So now, I want to propose one more idea. What would happen if we could erase a memory? So we don't really want to erase memory of grandma if we like her, but let's say instead of this memory being grandma, it was a trauma, right? Wouldn't it be lovely to be able to go in and select out that one terrible memory, right? Maybe it's not a trauma, maybe it's addiction, right? You have a memory for heroin, right? Or it could be anything negative, right? Maybe there's a food that you have this terrible aversion for, but you really want to eat it because you've heard it's really good. Can we take out and erase that memory of feeling sick, right, to a certain food? That would be sort of a weird reason, but something like a trauma or addiction, right? These are real things. Could there be treatments for some of these disorders? The more we understand about memory, right, then the more we can start to think about treatments and cures for all of the different types of memory disorders, not just post-traumatic memories, but maybe some of the dementias, right, as well. So there's some hope in the future. We can discuss the ethics of it also at some point. But there's some research on a chemical called PKM-zeta. PKM-zeta is a chemical, there are like over 100 chemicals that are involved in like forming these memory circuits, right, these neural circuits. A lab in downstate chose PKM-zeta and because it was involved in the memory process, in the formation of these circuits. And they created a drug called ZIP that would interfere with PKM-zeta. So it would interfere with the ability for PKM-zeta to do its work. And what they found was that it wiped out memories in rats, right? In mice, sorry. So it wiped out spatial memory and also memory for taste aversion. So there's a lot going on in this screen. We're just going to focus here. This is a very simple type of maze. It's just a circle, right? And what they do is they put mice into this circle, this platform, and they track their movements. And what they begin to notice is they like to stay on the outside. They don't like to go into the middle too much. They stay on the periphery. And then what they do is they put in a shock zone. So it kind of looks like a Trivial Pursuit wedge, right? They put in a shock zone. And so if a mouse would step into there, they would receive an electric shock. They learn very quickly to avoid this shock zone. They don't want to get shocked, right? So you can see they're avoiding the shock zone. Then what they did was after they learned to avoid the shock zone, they gave one group an injection of saline. So nothing, right? Just a placebo to see does injecting them make them do anything. And then they gave the others that drug ZIP, right, which would block PKM-zeta. And what did they find? Those that were injected with saline, they retained the memories. They avoided that shock zone because they're like, I remember. Now there was no shock zone anymore, but they're not taking any chances, right? I remember the other day there was a shock zone there. I'm going to avoid it. But what about those that were given PKM-zeta? Totally forgot, or it seems, right? The memory was gone. They looked just like those before the training occurred, right? Totally wiped out spatial memory. They also did stuff with taste aversion. So they gave them, like, let's say, Kool-Aid, cherry Kool-Aid flavored water, and then injected them with a drug that made them violently ill. So no mouse is going to touch cherry Kool-Aid anymore, just like no human, right, will do that either. When they were given ZIP, they went, started drinking cherry Kool-Aid like nothing had ever happened to them, right? So this drug did have the ability to wipe out certain memories. Now, this is mice, right? But there's some promise. There's another drug called propranolol, right? And this actually blocks hormones, the steroid hormone, the stress hormones. So when there's a highly emotional or traumatic event, right, we release hormones. We release adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, and they go back to the brain, right? And they affect the amygdala, right? That part of the brain that's involved in those emotional memories. So this drug blocks the effects of these stress hormones so that it doesn't go to the amygdala, and it doesn't seem to be that stressful or that traumatic of a memory. Right? This was not tested in humans yet either, right? So there is some stuff going on in the future, potentially in the future, to wipe out memories. But the big question is if I wipe out my memory for my trauma, what happens to the other neural networks, right? So if it's immediate, you probably haven't formed too many, but what if it's war? There's a lot of trauma in soldiers that come back from war, but there were also some good memories as well, right? And also it could be used for, I just think the Born series, right? Erasing memories. It's kind of pretty scary. So there's the potential for some real good, right? But there are also a lot of things that we need to think about when we create such a drug. Okay, so we talked a lot about memory today. Next week we're going to continue talking about cognition and cognitive processes. So there's a lot more about memory, mainly how reliable are our memories. We have memories, and sometimes we're sure our memories are extremely accurate. But we're going to see that Elizabeth Loftus has done a lot of research on this, and that memories are pretty fallible, right? They're fragile, and they're fallible. So we'll talk more about how reliable are our memories. Can we create false memories, right? Maybe think something happened to us when it actually never happened to us. And then also talk about thinking and maybe some of the strategies that we use to make decisions. How reliable are these decision-making strategies? We're sure that we're right? We're really confident, but are they good decisions, right? So we'll talk more about that, and also in the last class we'll talk about language as another cognitive function and try to bring it all together. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.